Let me start with my personal thanks to the conference organizers. In November last year, I could have not imagined that within a year such an encounter as today it could be ever possible. Participants from Australia, Germany and Poland, representing different personal and professional relations to indigenous Australians and various fields of expertise, may meet each other in the city where the part of the Klaatsch collection is still stored, to discuss together about its difficult past and potential futures. Let me start with the ethical disclaimer. All I'm going to say today could be distressing for the members of Australian indigenous communities, as my paper deals with the issue of human remains of indigenous Australians who are dehumanized, taken far from their homeland, and who awaits their return, having been kept as part of the university collection in Wrocław, Poland, formerly Breslau, Germany, since 1907, that is for almost 120 years. About my positionality, ladies and gentlemen, for many various reasons, I'm an outsider to the topic of Hermann Klaatsch's legacy. I don't have Australian roots, I don't speak German, I am not a biologist, I don't work in a museum. However, as a cultural anthropologist, as a museum studies researcher, and as a memory activist, I feel involved and motivated to engage with this sensitive heritage. The relevant community I belong in this regard is community of implication, to use the term proposed by Professor Erika Lehrer from the Concordia University in Montreal, in order to include people who are affected by or can be said to be implicated in certain tangible or intangible cultural products in ethical terms. To adapt this concept, I have to repeat what Professor Eckenbrecht said already, that human remains are by no means objects, they are human beings, and as such, they cannot be reduced to the status of cultural products. However, the concept and the practices of creating and maintaining of anthropological scientific collection with all the assumptions behind there is a very cultural product indeed, and as such might be, and moreover, even should be, denaturalized and denormalized. Therefore, my objectives are threefold. On the level of ethical involvement, to critically engage with the status quo, to unlearn what is perceived as indisputable and objective, to look for and discuss what should be done to restore social justice in bilateral relations and global contexts. On the level of public history and memory activism, to advocate for a general standard that the history of collections implicated by difficult past should not be hidden from general public, but instantly should be openly discussed in public sphere, in lectures, open debates, workshops, conferences. That is basically what we are doing now. And also as an important part of the museum narrative presented on the exhibitions. And then on the research level, as an anthropologist and museum studies researcher, I would like to reframe and rewrite the history of Polish anthropology, in particular, to reconstruct why and how in practice was cultural anthropology separated from physical anthropology, or just anthropology, adjectiveless anthropology, in post-war Poland, and how this process was affected by and or developed in the collection management policies introduced in the Polish museum sector after the Second World War. Today, I'm going to tell you something about the history of the Klaatsch collection in post-war Poland, Klaatsch legacy in Polish museums, and to address some dimensions and features making this heritage truly sensitive. Some of human remains of indigenous Australians, previously collected by German comparative anatomist and physical anthropologist Hermann Klaatsch during his fieldwork in Australia, are still kept in storages of the Museum of Men at the Human Biology Department of the University of Wrocław. Today, Wrocław in Poland, before 1945, to remind you, Breslau in Germany. I first learned about this collection in 2020 when I was browsing the museum's website looking for its opening hours in the search for a potential case to study as a postdoctoral researcher within the EU Horizon 2020 international research project ECOS on European colonial heritage modalities in entangled cities. But it was far too late for my visit. The seat of the museum at Kuźnicza Street in Wrocław, former Joseph Convict or Heinrich Steffens house, also known as Collegium Anthropologicum, once closed to the public because of the COVID-19 restrictions, had been being refurbished for a few months, and at that time, and the museum permanently closed to the public. As it occurred a few years later, the museum has never opened again, neither in this venue nor elsewhere. However, the museum website provided me with the information about the history of its collection and the ways they were preserved during and after the Second World War. It was clearly stated there that the origins of the Anthropological Museum date back to the pre-war period when collections began to be collected at the then Institute of Anthropology of the Medical Faculty of the German University of Wrocław. The name Breslau was not mentioned. The institute was described as headed by Professor Egon von Eichstätt without further developing of his biography, and considered one of the most dynamic research centers of this type in the world. After the war, in 1945, according to the same source, the Department of Anthropology of the Polish University of Wrocław was established with Dr. Karol Stojanowski as its head. Thanks to cooperation between Polish anthropologists and Professor Eichstätt, it was possible to locate part of the surviving German pre-war collections. Then the crucial part of the descriptions was presented on the website to cite. Information obtained from Professor von Eichstätt also made it possible to locate the famous Hermann Klaatsch collections of exotic skulls, moved in the last months of the war and hidden in the tower of the castle in Bobrowice Śląskie. The collection was found in October 1946. As a result of poor storage conditions, out of total of 400 skulls, only 140 was salvaged, including 80 Australian and 60 African ones. Human Biology Department Museum's collections are used for research and didactic activities. At first, I was confused by a word choice. At that time, I knew literally nothing about Klaatsch, nor his research in Australia, nor skulls he acquired. It wasn't famous for me at all. And it has to be said that I learned about Klaatsch and his legacy for the very first time in my life, exactly from the Wrocław Museum of Men's self-description published on its website. At the same time, I found the used language, especially the expression exotic skulls, inappropriate and outdated. The location stated on the museum website as the place where the Klaatsch collection was evacuated to and hidden during the war also involves a fascinating mistake. Bobrowice Śląskie, where the collection was supposedly found in the tower of the castle, simply does not exist. There are Bobrowice and Bobrowniki Śląskie, but neither of these locations hosts any castle with or without a tower, nor even a tower without a castle. This inaccuracy intrigued me a lot and led me to start my own research, beginning with fact-checking on the elementary level, the task which I haven't completed yet and maybe never will. Thanks to correspondence with Joanna Lamparska, an author of popular guidebooks on mysteries of Lower Silesia, I got to know that the Klaatsch collection was hidden during the war in the village named from November 1946 up to today, Siedlęcin, before the war German Boberorsdorf, that happened to be called between May 1945 and October 1946 with use of 3 different temporary names: Borowice, Bobrowice, Sobięcin. In contrast to previously mentioned villages and towns, in this Bobrowice Siedlęcin village, there is a tower-like fortified manor. The author of the text published on the museum website used the temporary Polish name of the village from the exact time of post-war rediscovery of the Klaatsch collection that happened in October 1946. That is just a month before the village has been renamed. However, he or she did not mention the contemporary name of this place, nor the German one, as it was transparently obvious for the readers, or just opposite. The whole story maybe was forgotten, unknown, and unlikely to locate on contemporary map. My hypothesis was that this fragment of the text from the museum website may come from much older sources. The oldest one I have found so far, which provides the same information in a very similar way, is a description of the Wrocław Center of Polish Anthropology, coming from the book about research centers for anthropology established in post-war Poland, the book which was published originally in 1959. Another, even more important questions I was provoked by reading the museum narrative was about the origins and the scope of the Klaatsch collections, as it didn't mention that its Australian part had originated from Klaatsch's own fieldwork, nor that there are not only human skulls in this collection, but also bones from human skeletons. And it didn't precise how Klaatsch had come into possession of human skulls from other areas than Australia, which he had never visited. In 1955, a Polish anthropologist, Halina Milicerowa, stated in her monograph Krania Australica that after the Second World War, Polish anthropologists found an inventory of the Klaatsch collections in the archive of the Department of Anthropology in Wrocław, in which there was a list of around 200 human skulls, out of which only 80 survived poor storage conditions during the last months of war. Milicerowa did not specify where those 200 skulls had come from, but both in terms of belonging to cultural and social groups, geographical areas of research, or ways Klaatsch got them, but she described in details all 80 skulls that she identified as coming from Australia and listed in the inventory of the Klaatsch collection. Professor Erkenbrecht wrote in 2018 that entire Klaatsch collection of human remains procured in Australia originally amounted to 95 individuals, and that the number of skulls from Klaatsch collection housed in Wrocław did not exceed 70 skulls during her visit. So it's one of the contradictory contradictions in numbers. Yeah. The numbers given by Milicerowa and Erkenbrecht are rather similar, and there may be no contradiction in this data. However, both researchers provided another explanation for the origins of this collection. While Professor Erkenbrecht, also today, has evidence for grave violating activities committed by Klaatsch, using knowledge mainly coming from his own letters, notebooks, and personal diaries, Milicerowa focused on the ways skulls were identified in the Klaatsch collection's inventory and on permanent markers put on the skulls. According to her, both in the inventory list and in the denotation placed on the skulls and other skeletal bones, the letter R and the following number is inscribed, what made her sure that the whole craniological material from the Klaatsch collection stored in Wrocław originally came from the collection of Walter E. Roth, already mentioned also by Professor Erkenbrecht, protector of the Aboriginal Australians in Queensland. At the same time, Milicerowa did not mention any letters key as markers neither in the inventory nor on the skulls. I don't have time to present my hypothesis what could have happened, but maybe it will be a time at the discussion part of this session. But let's skip. Okay. In the history of Klaatsch legacy in Polish context, there are plenty of such inconsistencies and ambiguities. What we know for sure is that the human remains identified as coming from the Klaatsch collection are still stored and protected in the Museum of Man in Wrocław, while the ethnographic artifacts from the same collection were moved to Warsaw in 1953 and since then have been stored and protected in the State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. The history of transfers and appropriation of the Klaatsch collection after 1945 reveals the Polish state policy regarding the ownership of the museum objects that used to be property of German institutions or citizens before the war. In post-war Poland, formerly German assets were forcefully and massively nationalized, and particularly valuable goods were moved to the state museums. Warsaw, by default, was place of delivery of the museum objects moved from cities like Wrocław, located on former German territories incorporated to post-war Poland. What is untypical in this story is the direction of transfer of human remains from pre-war Polish scientific collections that in the mid-1950s were moved from Warsaw to Wrocław to be merged with the post-German ones, including the Klaatsch collection. It was almost the same moment, around 1953, when all the ethnographic objects from Klaatsch collection were moved to the State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw, and when the collections of the Institute, pre-war Polish Institute of Anthropological Sciences, affiliated with the Warsaw Scientific Society, were incorporated into the resources of the newly established state-led Polish Academy of Sciences, and as such were moved to its newly established Department of Anthropology located in Wrocław. Just after the war, Klaatsch collection of human remains was moved back to the city, which had been newly incorporated into Poland, and under its new post-war borders, subject to the forced expulsion of the German population and renamed as Wrocław. As part of this dramatic transformation, in August 1945, the Uniwersytet Breslau was renamed as Uniwersytet Wrocławski. In the first post-war decades, Wrocław became the bedrock of Polish anthropology, which followed the traditions of the pre-war research center of Lwów, Lemberg, today's Lviv, in Ukraine. In addition to the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wrocław, the city also housed the newly created Department of Anthropology of the Polish Academy of Sciences, formed in December 1952, which quickly developed into the largest anthropological research center in Poland. The university's pre-war German anatomical collections, which survived the war, were merged with similar collections transferred from other institutions in Poland and then used for research and didactic activities. In order to store and protect these collections, the Museum of Men in Wrocław was established in 1954, and as a joint project of the Department of Anthropology of the Polish Academy of Sciences and the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wrocław. To my knowledge, human remains from the Klaatsch collection have never been presented publicly, neither at this museum nor elsewhere. For many decades, the access to the Museum of Men was limited only to researchers and students of anthropology. However, in 1997 or 2012, the Museum of Men was opened for general public, but after less than 2 decades, in 2020, was closed again. For a few years, the museum has not offered any permanent or temporary exhibitions for general public. The museum lost its main venue at Kuźnicza Street, and one of the museum founders, the Department of Anthropology of Polish Academy of Sciences, was incorporated in 2016 into the structures of the Ludwig Hirschfeld Institute of Immunology and Experimental Therapy. But a second museum founder, in the meanwhile renamed as Human Biology Department, is still responsible for storage of human remains from University of Wrocław museum collections. But a Klaatsch ethnographic collection remained in Wrocław, formerly Breslau, until 1953, when it was transferred to the State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. Today, this museum houses about 300 cultural artifacts collected in Australia by Klaatsch. These artifacts account for the majority of the museum's Australian collection, which, despite its rather modest size, is Poland's largest collection of exhibits from Australia. The Australian collection of the State Ethnographic Museum is also not presented to the general public. It was closed with a view to rearrange the exhibition and rewrite its narrative after its critical evaluation published in 2012. And some more theoretical explanation. It was only recently when museum and heritage professionals started disputing that among so-called post-German heritage, there are also objects that were not originally German in terms of ownership or provenance. For instance, those taken over by the Third Reich from its victims. Among them, there are artworks looted by German Nazis during the war, or the property of Jews expropriated on the basis of anti-Semitic racist legislation or murdered in the Holocaust. Among them, there are also, as in the Klaatsch collection example, human remains and cultural goods from non-European areas, implicated by colonial context of inequality, injustice, and violence. The latter situation might be defined by a notion of second-hand colonialism, a term proposed by Dr. Caroline Linhuijsen from the Open University of the Netherlands to describe colonial ambitions, imaginary, and complicity of nation-states such as Poland that did not have colonies of their own, and what's more, were themselves exposed to plundering perpetrated by other countries sometimes, but at the same time, they have benefited from global colonial matrix of power indirectly. Here you can see the short citation from Małgorzata Milanowska, an art historian, museum professional, and former Ministry of Culture, that say, we may wonder to what extent the former German collections are of clear provenance in Poland. If a hypothetical collection of Yakut art created in 19th century in Berlin found its way, for example, to an archaeological museum in Łódź, should it be returned to the Germans or the Yakuts, or perhaps kept there? In fact, we do not need a hypothetical collection to prove that the call for decolonization in the museum sector is indeed relevant in Poland. There are many museum collections or single museum objects in Poland that are highly problematic in terms of their entangled colonial provenance or legacies, which at the same time often relate to Poland's unique historical experience. And there is, of course, 1 minute, sure, something more, human remains in Polish museums, something that make this heritage truly sensitive. Emilia Jastrzębska has published her report. It was published officially in January this year by Polish National Institute of Museums. And it is said in the report that at least 96 Polish museums out of around 1,000 have collections of human remains in their storages. 75 out of those 96 museums collect human remains coming from archaeological excavations. And 41 out of those 75 museums still present human remains at their temporary or permanent exhibitions. And the Museum of Men in Wrocław is listed among the scope of this research in this report. Ladies and gentlemen, that will be my last slide. Unobvious analogies between Museum of Men in Wrocław and State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. They both are implicated by the Klaatsch legacy and responsible for protecting his former collection from Breslau. They both are not presenting anything from the Klaatsch collection on their exhibitions nowadays, and they both are affected now or soon will be affected by decolonial processes in this regard. In 1945, we colonized a colonizer. Today, we need to decolonize ourselves. Thank you very much.